See if we can answer it tonight. We'll do our best to answer it. Please be respectful to each other in the chat. So if you do want to try and help out the engineer or one of your colleagues who posts a question tonight, then please be respectful when you respond to them. The whole idea of this evening is that collectively we'll help each other out with the aim of improving our collective knowledge and understanding of all things BS7671 and the world of electrical installations. So yeah, please, the whole idea of this evening just to help each other out and see if we can all come away having learnt something tonight. So without any further ado, we'll have a look at the question that we posted out earlier today. The question we asked was, for compliance with BS7671, can I use a plug and socket outlet to provide a means of emergency switching? And we gave you 4 optional answers. We said yes, you can always use a plug and socket for emergency switching, or yes you can if the plug and socket is local, or yes you can if the plug and socket is lockable, or answer D was no, you never can. So what did we think to that, Rich? What was our combined answer on that one?
Well, the combined answer, the consensus here is never. No, never. If you look at table 537.4, it lists all the types of devices that we might use, whether they for isolation, emergency, functional, and you will note under there that whilst it is suitable for functional use, and of course you can use it as sockets and plug to isolate, it is not for emergency. If you think about where a plug and socket would normally be, you wouldn't get to it quick enough to use for an emergency device. And in fitting anything for emergency, it needs to be readily accessible and easy to do that without causing risk of shock.
And I think one of the things that we talked about earlier was, Rich, as well, the last thing you would want is if you'd unplugged something to achieve emergency switching off, and then somebody of course plugged it straight back in again, so it would kind of defeat that object of making it a permanent switch off.
Yeah, very true.
Okay, so as I said, and actually somebody's just put that in the chat as well and said, yeah, some idiot would plug it back in. So yeah, although we'll let idiot pass, that we don't normally allow that in the chat, but we'll let that pass because I think the census is right. When I looked at the results of the polls earlier, and yeah, 60, I think it was across the different platforms, it was a little bit different. LinkedIn was virtually all saying no, never, and referring to the same reg as that we've picked out there tonight. And Facebook was a little bit different in that about 60% were saying no, never, but some were saying yes if it was local or if it was lockable. So yeah, just to make it clear, it's never acceptable as far as 7671 is concerned. Okay. Please do put your questions that you'd like us to have a look at tonight in the chat, and while you're doing that, we'll rattle through some that have been left over from previous sessions. So the first one of those is a common question that we get quite often. Is it acceptable to use a building structural steel as an earth electrode? A nice and simple answer on this one. It is yes, it is. There's a regulation which gives us great guidance on which items can be used and are recognised for the purposes of an earth electrode. It's regulation 542.2.2, and it lists all the items, including earth rods, pipes, tapes, wires and plats, and the one that we were after, underground structural metalwork embedded in foundations or other metalwork installed in the foundation. So perfectly acceptable to use structural steel. Couple of things I'd add as well is you're probably going to get a nice low resistance, because you'll have a lot of structural steel generally in contact with true earth, so you will get a good conductive path with a nice low resistance. And of course the reason that we can use it is because that structural steel is going to be maintained, it's going to be durable, it's going to be there for a long time, unless they drastically materially alter the building itself, which is why we're allowed to use it. So it is a nice conductive path, and we know it's going to be permanent as long as the building's there, which is why we're allowed to use it, because there may be other metalwork that we can't guarantee is going to be maintained to the same degree, and therefore that's why we're not allowed to use those things. Would you add anything more to that, Rich?
No, only other that when they do put in this sort of structural steel right into terra firma, remember earth is a big conductor, it's probably going to give you a very, very low impedance. It also creates like Faraday's cage in a building as well, so that should carry all the way through. It will be durable, and so long as it isn't corroding, or it's not subject to corrosion, it's probably the best you're gonna get. So yeah, it would be a very, very good earth electrode.
Yeah. Okay, another question from previous sessions, again a common one that we get and a little bit related to the first one. Does a bathroom fan isolator used to switch off for mechanical maintenance need to be located next to the fan? So does the switch for mechanical maintenance need to be located next to the fan? What's our thoughts there, Rich?
Not necessarily. So it's any isolator should be clearly marked, and so that you know what it's for use. If it's remote from it, of course it should be marked. But as well, in a bathroom, it may well be that. Remember, there's certain things that can be fitted in, can only be installed in certain zones as well. You really wouldn't put that isolator there unless there was risk, unless that fan was at risk of getting someone entangled or anything, which is highly unlikely. So it doesn't need to be there. It should also take out all live parts. That would include a neutral as well. Yeah, but it's as you said, it doesn't have to be local, and 7671 confirms that, because it talks about you either have to identify its role by a position, in which case it would be local, or you have durable marking so as to identify it for its intended use, which tells us we can use it. So for example, depending upon the location of the fan, you might be able to rely on the breaker in the board as your means of switching off for mechanical maintenance or isolation. So yeah, it doesn't have to be located adjacent, but 7671 makes it clear if it's not adjacent, then it has to be identified and durably marked or labelled to identify its use. And that's similar. We've just thrown up the reg there as well for when it's used as an isolator, almost virtually exactly the same wording. Okay, another good one. This is quite a long one, so we'll leave this question up for a while so that people have an opportunity to think about it. So this was based on a true call to our technical helpline. An engineer said, "I'm working on a 7-storey new build block of flats which does not have AFDDs fitted on the socket circuits. When they inquired why, they were told that the building was designed to the 18th edition
2018 Amendment 1 dated 2020, when AFDDs weren't a requirement. And the engineer has asked, is this acceptable? So as I say, this one was specifically around AFDDs, but we do get a common theme in this, where we get people asked about can they complete work to a previous edition of 7671, and the answer is yes. If you look at the front of 7671 in the introduction section, there's a statement in there that clearly says when that edition of 7671 came into effect. And the one that we're on at the moment, our brown book, BS 7671 2018 plus Amendment 2 2022, it says that it was issued on the 28th of March 2022, could be implemented immediately, but the previous version, 7671 2018 Amendment 1, which was dated 2020, would remain current and wasn't withdrawn until the 27th of September. So in a nutshell, if the construction project was designed before the 27th of September 2022, then 7671 2018 Amendment 1 2020 would still be current, and it would be perfectly acceptable to complete the project based on that previous version of 7671. You would need to make sure that the declaration section of your installation certificate reflects that. So it would be based that the installation would have been designed, constructed, inspected and tested to that previous version, Amendment 1 2020. And you know, that would, your certification would need to confirm that. So obviously we can't build to an older one and then certificate it to the current one. You can build to an older one but make sure it is then certificated to that current to that previous version as well. So it's not precluded within 7671. In fact, 7671 allows it. Quite often you need to consider it contractually, so there might be some contractual requirements that say which version it should be, or they might have some open words to say that all work should be completed to the relevant current standard at the time of completion. So it's worthy of raising a concern, and on a big project like this it's probably worth doing that in writing so that you've got confirmation. But it is something that happens quite a lot, especially on larger projects where the time scale between design and construction can span different versions of 7671. Would you add anything to that, Rich? And have you got experience of where that's happened?
I have experience of that, where jobs where the original contract was agreed under one version of regs, and due to the time of the contracts, the contracts are finishing on another. And you're quite right with saying in some of the contracts, sometimes the wording by those who are issuing the contract can be vague. It's very important that those things are established as to where they say it should be finished to the current version. Then in that sense they're saying that if a reg's change and something has changed and should come in, then they should be making allowances. It's not from your bill, but it's important to establish those sort of things. You would be within your rights to stick to the contract that it was agreed, that the specification was agreed to, and then they can argue whether, oh well, now you should be putting AFDDs in, because there is a cost implication. If at the time it was designed and the AFDDs wasn't a requirement, then really you should stick to it, and that should be clearly written on the certificate. It should the version of the regs that it was designed to should be inserted.
Yeah, spot on, Rich. And it's so So as far as 7671 is concerned, yes, it's perfectly acceptable. Just make sure that you certificate the installation to the edition that it was designed and installed to. But yeah, raise concerns with the appropriate people just to make sure that the contract doesn't say something else. And quite often the customer will expect, if something's completed in whatever year, they'll expect it, rightly or wrongly, they'll expect it to meet the requirements that were applicable in that year. So it's a conversation that you should have as early as possible to clarify and make sure that you're not going to end up with it in a situation where there's a big problem or a perceived problem at the end of the project, because the contracts people and the customer are expecting one thing, but the design and install is based on something else. Okay, another one that, again, a little bit related, we do quite often get is after the completion of a new installation, who decides the recommended date for the next inspection of the installation? So that's a requirement on our electrical installation certificate, that when it's produced it has to include a recommendation for the next inspection. We do get asked who's that responsible to, and it's quite clear. It's specifically stated in 7671 that it's the designer of the installation. And if we are to go to regulation 134.2.2, it says that the designer of the installation shall make a recommendation for the interval to the first periodic inspection and test as detailed in chapter 64. The interval should be recorded in terms of years or months, and should take into consideration any legislative or licensing requirements. So for example, if it was a building that did have a license, then the licensing authority might specify a frequency for inspection. You should also consider the quality of maintenance that the installation can reasonably be expected to receive during its intended life. So the designer would have to have an understanding of how the installation is going to be used, who's going to use it, what maintenance regimes are in, and factor all those in when he comes to make that recommendation. Under no circumstances should that recommendation be left blank or not applicable. And there's plenty of guidance around that. There's some very good industry guidance that's agreed, that gives the recommended period for the first inspection for most common types of installations. And also it reflects the fact that in some premises periodic inspection and testing might be replaced by an adequate regime of continuous monitoring and maintenance. For example, in manufacturing and production facilities where they've got 24-hour production, then they'll have continuous monitoring and maintenance regimes which can then be used in place of periodic inspection. Anything you'd add to that one, Rich?
That it actually ties into legislation, Electricity at Work regs, regulation 4.2, which talks about installations being maintained in a safe condition. And of course, so from a design point of view, that's why it is the design of the original installation should be making that judgment. Obviously, I say obviously, but subsequent inspections based on the wear and tear, that's where the inspector's judgment comes in. Often they don't fall outside of that initial recommendation unless they can see evidence of things which might suggest that it should be more frequent. Indeed, if it's benign, it can be lengthened, but it's the designer in the first place that makes that decision. And it does, as I said, it ties in with legislation as well as licensing. No,
spot on, because it's the requirements of Electricity at Work regs that drive the periodic inspection requirements, isn't it? Because it's the Electricity at Work regs that say that the installation has to be maintained, which is why that regime of either periodic inspection or an adequate regime of continuous monitoring and maintenance. Right, we're starting to get some questions in the chat, which is good. Please do post your questions. So we'll start to have a look at some of those now. And the first one I can see is can additions, again, common question to the helpline, can additions be carried out to an existing lighting circuit with no CPC for the installation of class 2 fan and the replacement of class 2 lights in a bathroom? So if I sort of reword it slightly, we're saying that we've got an existing lighting circuit without a CPC, but the accessories are class 2. Can we add or alter to that circuit? And a second part, same engineers asked, what would you put on the accompanying certificate for the means of protection? So first stage, can I add to that circuit? Well, yes, you can, but be mindful that your additions and alterations need to comply with current regs, and current regs will tell us that we need to have a CPC at each point. So if you're adding points to that installation, let's say you were to add another light fitting or add another switch, then your new switch or new light fitting will need a CPC in order for you to comply with current regs. That doesn't necessarily mean you have to bring a CPC up to all the existing points, but your new points need to comply with current regs. So that's it in a nutshell. And then with regards to the certificate, that's where that box which talks about comments on existing installation becomes very important, because you would be required to document what the condition of the installation was when you were asked to add or alter it, to make it very clear that it wasn't you that had missed or omitted that CPC in the first place. So that's where that box becomes very clear. So you could add or alter to it. Your additions and alterations need to comply with the current regs, which would mean in this instance, if you were to add a point, a switch, a light fitting, you would need to run a CPC to that point, even though the rest of the circuit doesn't have a CPC. But what have I missed anything there, Rich? Or
no, not necessarily. I mean, if it's in a dwelling as well, and it's also that the additional protection requirements of it as well for the luminaire, not just the CPC but the RCD, and it's these things often come up if you weren't modifying it and it was existing, and it could then be classed as a class 2 circuit, and all the fittings were of class 2. It's where you're picking that earth up from, that CPC from, to now introduce class 1. I would also be thinking that it would need to be some sort of label on the board to warn that it was sort of class 2 as well as class 1 in there. It's what's called other required labelling. All of that information is important, because remember, this is about shock protection.
Yeah, no, that's a really valid point in that additional labelling, because especially if you were in a domestic situation where you could have a DIYer who would then change that plastic plate switch for a nice brushed aluminium one, and then of course he's got no CPC protecting that conductive plate switch. So yeah, very important, and again something for the person doing the additions and alterations to consider. Perhaps some additional documentation on his minor works or installation certificate to confirm that, and yeah, then have that conversation with the customer, and depending upon the relationship with the customer, maybe even document it.
Sorry, Sam, I chuckled earlier because you mentioned comments on existing, and very often on a certificate, what we don't tend to realise, or what's often seen, is people don't put comments on the existing which demonstrate that they have checked for the things for safety within the installation, where the existing, that it can take, that it's adequate for the altered circumstances. And it would be important to put those notes in there, as you quite rightly mentioned, that the existing circuit may have been compliant to a different regs. What you're trying to prove, it's no less safe. It's not just, it talks about the existing, including that of the distributor, but where you're adding to a circuit, and that circuit might have been of class 2 or class 2 up to that point, that is where you'd be putting it, because what you're doing is you're altering that circuit, and you may well be putting additional things on it which might not sort of continue that circuit. We tend not to wire just in twin anymore. I would argue, if you're going to add to it, so it would be of class 2 wiring, and that's also the final. So it would be measures other than ADS.
Yeah, it's a possible scenario, and then document that accordingly. But again, making it clear, so that what you want to do is avoid somebody with limited ability or knowledge changing that class 2 item for a class 1. Okay, looking at another question that's in the chat. What code would an IPX4 standard domestic fan in zone 2 of a bathroom attract on an EICR if the said fan is within 30 centimetres of a shower head that's not fixed, and as a result direct water jets to said IPX fan are likely? I think that's one where it would be, a good inspection with perhaps knowledge of how long has that fan been in that location. So with it being IPX4, it does meet the requirements of zone 1 and zone 2 external influences for section 701. But it does, I'm just trying to look, the electrical, if it were to be exposed to water jets, 7671 does recommend an IPX5. So yeah, I think it's my suggestion would be to have a look at the fan. Is there any signs of water ingress? But that would be based on a knowledge of how long has it been there, because if it's only just recently been installed, perhaps it hasn't had time to be detrimentally affected by its environment. So have a look at it and then see, and obviously if there is evidence of water ingress, which then could make the fan not operate correctly or be potentially dangerous, then you could consider a recommendation of a C2. But I think it would be really based on what the actual inspection tells you, rather than just the fact that it doesn't meet the IP requirements for direct water jets, but it does meet it for a standard domestic bathroom. So my suggestion would be a good inspection to then determine whether there is any signs of ingress or not. Anything you'd add to that, Rich?
No, it's a weird one, isn't it? Because you do get fans within a zone, and of course, if they're within a zone, it's subject to spray, as you quite rightly said. It's IPX5. If it's new, you can't really see that it's been detrimentally affected. So it would take quite a thorough inspection. It's also how it's been installed, whether it's been installed as to sealing it, and all of that. And of course, you're also going to look at some of the manufacturers' instructions with regard into whether that was suitable for that zone in the first place. So it's a little bit of research there, isn't it? It's not the easiest one to code on that score. There are a lot of factors to take into consideration.
And another thought would be, if you have got concerns but you believe that it looks all right now, perhaps because it hasn't been in that environment for very long, then you can always use that when you factor in your recommended date for your next inspection, that maybe you bring it forward to what you would do if everything were okay based on the installation type. So that's another thing that you can do that then kind of allays a future concern, perhaps, by bringing forward the date for the next inspection if you feel that it could be detrimentally affected, but it just hasn't at the moment because it's not been in that environment for very long. Another one is, if I install Wilex isolation switch with 60 amp fuse, and I can take the cable 16mm twin and earth with a separate 16mm earth cable, how much wire do I need to be buried the cable with in zone, and then it disappears? So not sure if we've got the full answer, but if we're talking about burying cables in a wall, but he's referencing a zone there, so I'm not really sure. But my first thoughts were, you've either got to consider 50mm depth or consider RCD protection or mechanical protection. But yeah, perhaps if you can give us a bit more information on that one, we might be able to help. But yeah, I don't think we've got a complete question there, to be honest. Next one, EICR plastic cover distribution board under a wooden stairs with RCD, will this be C2 or C3? The fact that it's plastic or it's combustible material, if it was under a wooden staircase, so it's seen as a potential high combustion risk, then recommendation is a C3. That's Best Practice Guide 4, which is industry agreed guidance that can be freely downloaded from Electrical Safety First website or from the NIC website. It's got some very good recommendations for some general conditions, and yeah, for a combustible or plastic consumer unit under a wooden stairs, we would recommend a C3 in terms of a recommended improvement, obviously to bring it up to the enhanced requirements of current regs. Next, we've got a comment, I think based around what we were talking about earlier about one of the questions with the additions and alterations to a circuit without a CPC. What's the CPC for if the fan is class 2? Adding class 2 fan without a CPC to an existing house circuit is fine if labelled and documented in their view. But I think the difference we were talking about there was an additional point, so an additional switch, an additional light in the installation would require a CPC to meet current requirements. Electrician issue part P for electrical work when these things are stopped because NIC or other bodies approved contractors do electrical work when law is passed. So not really sure if that's a definite question there. Somebody commenting on a date for a re-inspection is a good point, and that, yeah, I think again that's something that's often not considered. If you don't have access to the incoming mains on an EICR or an EIC, is it acceptable to leave that page not applicable, for example, on a block of flats? It would. I think if you're looking at an EICR, you've got a couple of options, haven't you? You've got agreed limitations which should have been known before the start. So again, it's a very unused or unknown requirement, but 7671 is quite clear in that if you don't know that installation that you've been asked to do a periodic inspection and test of, then you should go well, and there's no paperwork for it that you can have a review of before. So it does say, where no previous documentation is available, investigation of the electrical installation shall be undertaken prior to carrying out the periodic inspection. So those things then should become apparent before you start, and then you can either agree with them, agree with the customer that they're not going to be considered, in which case it's an agreed limitation. But if you feel that it's contrary to the safety of the installation, then of course then you can make it clear that that's something that you do need to get into. The change recently in the EICR made it clear that the distributor's equipment should be visually inspected, but doesn't directly affect the outcome of the safety of the installation, because it's often outside of the control of the person doing the inspection and test, and quite often outside of the control of the person who owns the installation, because the intake equipment is owned by the DNO. So it shouldn't be left, unless there's a good reason. That good reason might be that you've done your initial walk round and inspection and agreed it as a limitation, making it clear to the person who's asked you to do the report what's the potential impact of it. And any thoughts on that, Rich, when you can't get access?
You can't get access. It is a limb. You can obtain information on it by inquiry, of course, but that doesn't mean that you've inspected it, and you should note that it is inaccessible. In actual fact, in some instances that could even be noted as an operational limb. That's again, the extent of limitations is very important to the inspector, because those are your disclaimers anyway. And if you can't get access to inspect it and see the condition of it, and it's only further up the line that you're checking that there appears to be a good earth, and the BNO bit, the bit that comes in, appears to be fine, you should be noting that on the certificate that it is not accessible. But as for the when you're filling in the characteristics of particularly in blocks of flats and things like that, they tend to come from either risers and Rye-Fields. More often than not, it is a three-phase 4-wire, but what you don't know is what the earthing arrangement is. When you do your ZSs or ZDBs, you will tend to get indication whether there is earthing, there is an earthing coming in, but it's how it's provided is the issue. At least it will satisfy things like fault protection, or it satisfies things like fault protection or your ZSs. But the inspection of that bit, interestingly enough, that's why I believe you can't inspect it. It's making mention of any defects if you can inspect it, to the distributor. But what you can't see, it's going to fall into the limitation category, and it should be clearly documented on the EICR.
Yep. And we've got a further comment to our discussion about additions and alterations to a circuit without a CPC. Another one of the engineers made a valid point about 7671 does refer to class 2 equipment, only class 2 items being acceptable only if they're under adequate supervision, where they're not likely to be changed to class 1. And that's an interesting thought or consideration when you look at domestic installations, because that's more likely to be an ordinary person rather than that installation being adequately supervised. So really good point, which then brings you to sort of the thing of, okay, again, look at your additions and alterations, make sure that your additions and alterations meet current requirements 7671 wise, including that addition of a CPC at each point. Comment on the existing installation in that box which says comments on existing installation, to make it clear that that's what was there already, and then have that conversation with the customer, may it be a homeowner, to talk them through what the possibilities are of leaving it as it is, what the potential dangers are associated with that. Okay. Another one that we've had held over from previously is again a common question that we get asked, is when people have done a periodic inspection and test, how quickly should potentially dangerous issues, the C2s, be corrected after the completion of a periodic inspection and test? So is there a defined time there, Rich?
Well, BS 7671 doesn't have a defined time. But the definition in time is probably more rental sector legislation, where it talks about anything requiring urgent attention is addressed within 28 days. But BS 7671 really refers to it as it's really about it being timely, and sometimes it's when you're looking at that C2, it's what you've got to factor in is the risk of it being left and it presenting that danger itself, so that it becomes immediate, or such as lack of earthing and something then goes under fault, or something which is broken which could deteriorate. But it's BS 7671 doesn't give a specific time. Rental sector gives 28 days, I believe. Yeah.
Spot on. And there's no so 7671 just talks about C2s should be dealt with as a matter of urgency by a skilled person competent in electrical installation work. So not defined, but gives a steer. And then, like you say, the rented sector legislation, which I appreciate is currently only for England, talks about 28 days, and we would suggest that that's a reasonable time frame. A sort of a typical month, working month in terms of days. So that's a good guide in place where there isn't anything else specifically specified. Also want to point out that this is one of the questions which is answered on the RAG, the Wiring Regulations Advisory Group website. So again, hosted by Electrical Safety First, there's a whole series of questions and answers freely available. There's two sets of questions, one based on new installations, one based on inspection and test of existing installations and new, and gives some real good guidance for some general common questions. So if you're not aware of that, please do go and have a look at those RAG question databases on the Electrical Safety First website. RAG is the Wiring Regs Advisory Group. There's a whole bunch of people from across the industry, so ourselves are involved with that, as are NAPIT. You've got organisations like the IET, you've got manufacturers represented by BEMA, and various bodies across the industry. So it's really seen, and consensus has to be achieved to all of the questions and agreed answers. So it really is seen as good industry guidance. So you can use that to back up your recommendations and your answers to those same questions. Right, we've once again come to that time of the night. I just want to tell you about a few things. We've got more episodes of The Wire. There's one more episode of a very popular webinar series, The Wire, which we're going to be showing just before we break for the summer. that's the next wire is on Wednesday week, Wednesday the 10th of July at 8 o'clock, and it covers the topic of leadership essentials. So if you haven't already, please do go onto the NIC website and sign up for that wire. Please do stay in touch. So thank you very much for participating tonight. Stay in touch with us across all of the different social media platforms, Facebook, X, Instagram, YouTube, and LinkedIn. We are posting out on those regularly, so please do stay in touch, and if you've got questions, post them in to us as well. Our next Monday night Q&A will be on the first Monday of August, so we generally try and do these on the first Monday of every month, unless that coincides with a bank holiday. So next one will be Monday the 5th of August, and just want to say thank you very much. Thanks very much for all those that did put questions into the chat. If we haven't got round to your question, I do apologise, but what we'll do is we'll capture that and try and use it as part of the introduction to the next session in August. So yeah, please do join us. Thank you very much for participating. Hope it's been useful, and as I say, if you've got any questions that you've always had rattling around, please do post them to us and we'll do our best to try and answer them. Any closing thoughts from yourself, Rich?
No, it's been enjoyable, interesting, and it's nice to hear what people are asking out there. It informs me as an area engineer when I go out there. Some of these sort of questions that are coming up are typical of the questions that may arise during an assessment visit, so it helps me be able to sort of pass some of these things on to them. So it's been very enjoyable.
Yeah, no, it's been really good. Thanks very much, and hopefully we'll see you again on the 5th of August. Thank you.